Okay, how to possibly introduce this topic? I guess I've seen some YouTube comments where people have used the term the end of history, and when I read it, I guess it really struck a chord with me. I think that phrase is saying something important about the time we're living in. However, when I actually looked into the original meaning and the origin of the phrase, it seems, I don't know, off. And so that's what this essay is about. I'm going to tell you about its original meaning, and then I'm going to dismantle that old meaning and tell you what I think it should really mean. The End of History and the Last Man is a book of post-Cold War propaganda masquerading as intellectual political philosophy, written by Francis Fukuyama and published in 1992. It was written at the end of the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall fell, and American had to smugly gloat about it, declaring communism not only as defeated, but as an unusable form of governance. I'm not saying the Soviet Union was a great place to be in. I had a friend who lived in the Soviet Union until they were about 12, and she didn't have any fond memories or really anything good to say about it. But the book was used as a way for America to do a victory lap while declaring communism as a failed ideology, dismissed as not even worth considering. If you don't know, communism is a system of social organization based around common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and it allocates resources based on people's needs. This was seen to be in opposition to the governance style of the West, which is called liberal democracy and is done under capitalist economic systems. While the book does not even attempt to define communism at all, it does talk a bit about liberal democracy, a system that determines leadership by elections, different branches of government, rule of law, a market economy, private property, and holds the rights and freedoms of individuals belonging to that society as the most important ideal. All citizens are supposed to have a share in political power. I'm not going to split hairs about explicit definitions and terms he uses in the book, but I do need to explain what he turned out to be wrong about. I'm also trying not to make this political, so yeah, good luck to me on that, I guess. So this book, it declares that everyone professionally engaged in politics and foreign policy believed in the permanence of communism, but its worldwide collapse in the 1980s was almost totally unanticipated. The totalitarian state hoped to remake Soviet man himself by changing the very structure of his beliefs and values through control of the press, education, and propaganda. The family, religion, historical memory, language became targets, as society is systematically and methodically atomized. The ultimate goal of totalitarianism was not simply to deprive the new Soviet man of his freedom, but to make him fear freedom in favor of security and to affirm the goodness of his chains, even in the absence of coercion. They were contented inmates of the asylum, held not by bars and straitjackets, but by their own craving for security, order, authority, and other benefits the Soviet regime managed to throw in, like imperial grandeur and superpower status. I'd just like to say at this point, in the year 2026, you could take that same quote from his book, except substitute the word Soviet for American, and the results just might surprise you. Another thing as of this writing, China, Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, and North Korea are countries that all identify as communist. So saying communism was wiped out isn't really true. Now you could argue that they aren't real communist, but then was the Soviet Union really communist? I don't know. But I'd also argue that to properly evaluate the success or failure of a system like communism, you also need to consider how much other countries were purposely sabotaging and messing with them. At the very least, they were trying really hard to make them look bad. Back to his book, Fukuyama also says, "The soberest and most thoughtful minds of this century have seen no reason to think that the world is moving towards what we in the West consider decent and humane political institutions, that is, liberal democracy." He goes on to say that today we have trouble imagining a world that is radically better than our own, or a future that is not essentially democratic or capitalist. Within that framework, of course, many things could be improved. We could house the homeless, guarantee opportunities for minorities and women, improve competitiveness, and create new jobs. So yeah, how much progress have we made in those very obvious ways to improve our society since this was written? You could argue that we've improved rights for minorities and women, but are their lives substantially better since 1992? Homelessness has increased, competitiveness has been completely replaced by monopolies and megacorporations, and we're facing new waves of job losses. A lot of problems that weren't visible in the 90s are much more visible now. The people that vote in our elected representatives, their views and best interests are not being represented by elected officials, who instead are passing laws and making changes that benefit donors, of just a few wealthy people. Destructive data centers are being opened, and public services are being sold off to private companies, while politicians are becoming rich off of bribes. On page 202, Fukuyama says, "Modern liberal democracy recognizes all human beings by granting and protecting their rights. No one may harm the life of a child without being prosecuted by the criminal justice system." But we can see that, with the release of the Epstein files, many lives were harmed and ruined, and nobody is being prosecuted. The files are being censored and people are being protected. And you don't need me to go on a list explaining every problem with liberal democracies today, because you're living in it right now. You can see the problems when you walk down the streets, when you go to the airport, when you go to the grocery store or other places, third spaces, or try to socialize and spend your free time. Is this really the best governance humanity can ever offer? On page 296, Fukuyama says, "Classical political philosophy maintained that man had a dignity somewhere between the beasts and gods. But if you've been to the airport or an encounter with ICE agents, you could maintain that beasts are treated better than the human citizens of the United States." Back to Fukuyama's book on page 262, it says, "Given the fact that access to resources can be obtained peacefully through a global system of free trade, war makes much less economic sense than it did 200 or 300 years ago. The reality is that, basically, since the war in Vietnam, the United States, sometimes with liberal democratic allies, sometimes not, have been at war with a long list of countries, toppled governments, and plundered their resources. You can make excuses for it and try to wallpaper over it. You can try to argue things aren't functioning as a proper liberal democracy. But if you give it that leeway, then you have to give communism the same leeway, that it just wasn't representative of what it was supposed to be. Fact is that if this is not a liberal democracy we're living in today, then it certainly is the end result of a liberal democracy. So, established that liberal democracy has not been morally superior to communism, let's go back to the phrase end of history, where he talks about it back on page 46. "But we cannot picture a world that is essentially different from the present one and at the same time better. Other, less reflective ages also thought of themselves as the best, but we arrive at this conclusion exhausted from the pursuit of alternatives we felt had to be better than liberal democracy. If we are now at a point where we cannot imagine a world substantially different from our own, in which the future will not represent a fundamental improvement over our current order, then we might consider the possibility that, say it with me, history itself would be at an end." And that's his argument. We must be at the end of history because we can't imagine any better way of structuring society. This is as good as it's ever going to get. I have a problem with this because, and I hate to state the very obvious to Mr. Fukuyama, but a better vision of the future was available decades before. Surely you've heard of the TV show called Star Trek. Star Trek came out in September 1966, portraying a human future where humanity was united in cooperation, having done away with material scarcity. People set aside divisions and were free to pursue deeply fulfilling lives, while also having opportunities to achieve status in society and be recognized by making achievements and careers in science, research, and of course Starfleet. While you can argue that we aren't able to reach this type of utopia due to material limitations, we certainly aren't at the end of history in terms of what new types of governance we can establish. At this point, I also want to make another point about Star Trek, about the direction the franchise went, right around the series called Enterprise, which aired September 26, 2001. They decided to change the grand narrative around a cooperative humanity to a less utopian one, reflecting the harsh realities of capitalist liberal democracy. This culminated later in Star Trek Discovery, which stripped out every bit of the original Star Trek vision that made people fans of the series in the first place, leaving the show only with bits of visual aesthetic, even though many people couldn't quite articulate what it was about the newer show that made it so unlikable. Anyways, back to the point of systems of governance. I would argue that if you wanted to progress past liberal democracy and a next sort of logical step, you could move towards a system I'm going to refer to as a true democracy. With the internet, we have the ability to poll the entire population of a country and get feedback about what people actually want out of their government. We could make representative democracy obsolete because not only do we not need someone to ride their horses to Washington to go and vote on our behalf, but because of more recent events I discussed earlier showing that our governments have become corrupt and no longer make decisions on behalf of the constituents that they claim to represent. Instead, corporate interests or private capital are almost always the interests that are represented when new legislation is approved. A true democracy would stop politicians from being bribed and instead return to a one citizen, one vote, but with instant voting capabilities in the hands of every citizen. We could have everyone vote on every issue. So someone could table a requested change, let's say to increase healthcare spending with the goal of reducing wait times, then everyone in the country could log into an app on their phone or computer, read a summary of the changes, and vote yes or no on the issue. Of course, that would require people to be educated on the issues, but education is another eroded institution under our current liberal democracy. The current model of education is still based around training people to work in an orderly, productive fashion on a factory floor, originally called the Prussian education model, and is the model our current education system is based on. We could redesign our education system with the intent of creating citizens who are intellectually capable of educating themselves and making informed decisions on voting issues. However, there will also doubtlessly be some people who simply don't want to vote on every issue. But for that, there could be an option where people could give their voting right to someone they trust, who has similar opinions to them. Anyone would be able to temporarily give their voting ability to another citizen, who would then have greater voting power when they vote. And that would relieve burden on people who simply do not want to vote on everything. But that voting power could also be revoked at any time if they disagree with their voting choices, unlike our current system today, where politicians make promises and then vote to do the opposite of what they said they were going to do. Currently, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them as they go about tearing our government apart until the end of their term. This is all to make the point that there is still plenty of room to progress past liberal democracy, so the way Fukuyama has defined end of history I consider invalid. So, if liberal democracy system of governance does not represent the final pinnacle of political achievement, does that mean the term the end of history is obsolete? I don't think so. Because the way people have been using the phrase, I believe it's actually much more useful for informing us as to where we currently are, rather than as a political statement. There's a journalist, his name's Andrew Breitbart, who I don't really know much about, but there's a quote attributed to him where he says, "Politics is downstream from culture." And this is the connection I want to make now. The end of history is not a victorious mountain peak where we've achieved all there is to achieve. I believe the end of history is more like a low-lying stillwater swamp, where our culture is stuck. The phrase end of history perfectly matches the era of cultural stagnation we're in, where movies are all sequels, remakes, and reboots. Music sounds very similar, homogenized, repetitive, and bland, while experimentation is generally punished. The internet is overrun with bots reposting the same memes, AI slop, giving artificial comments and upvotes. Estimates from 2025 are that over 50% of the internet is now AI generated, with estimates it could be as high as 74%. Propaganda that pushes ideas that the majority of people are against are being propped up and given priority in algorithms. Culture isn't dead, but it is slowly drowning, with new ideas having no room to breathe and no platform where they can grow organically. Another thing that seems to be happening of late is that when the semblance of a new idea does pop up, it's immediately co-opted by corporations and influencers, turned into a trend, product lines, made to sell as much as possible before moving on to the next microtrend. People get sick of things after just weeks because the market saturation is so intense. As soon as something new comes in, it's everywhere. So going back to my Star Trek example, you can even see that at this point, as intellectual property has been pretty much beaten to death, turned from a socialist utopia to a world where harsh capitalist reality is the only inevitability. It went from a world of hope, exploration, pursuit of knowledge, and endless opportunities to a cruel, dark place where the purpose of space travel becomes exploitation of resources and war. It's a world nobody wants to be in anymore. This is what I argue the end of history actually is. So I'm going to just end with a quote on page 288 where it says, "Left to themselves, can those stable, long-standing liberal democracies of Europe and America be indefinitely self-sustaining, or will they one day collapse from some internal rot? Whether life there is truly satisfying, history will continue." Thanks for watching.